If I go to bed at midnight, my sleep cycle now just starts here. If you go to bed at midnight, you start here, right? So you've lost this big chunk of deep sleep here, right? You can't get that back. What's up, guys? Welcome back to the elitefts YouTube channel. Today's video is going to be kind of a lecture, I guess, all about sleep. So after we recently recorded a similar length video on auto-regulation that went down pretty well, we think, we thought that maybe we do a couple more of these longer form videos where we can kind of get a bit more into the weeds with some of these topics. And really, you know, sleep probably doesn't get enough attention. No matter what your goal is, what demographic you're in, it's going to be pretty important. So the goal of today's lecture, talk, whatever, is going to be to educate you about sleep, sleep architecture, the determining factors for the quality and duration of your sleep, why these might vary from person to person, and then, of course, what we can do then to improve our sleep all round. So this is going to be hopefully very useful for you and to give you some actionable takeaways so you can go ahead and implement these things to make your sleep better and, of course, then do everything else better in your life. Okay. So what we're going to be looking at today is, first off, addressing how much sleep we need, because, you know, we kind of just put like 8, maybe 9 hours out there as like a ballpark figure, but the reality is that, like every question, the true answer is it depends. And I will try not to say that too much as this video goes on, but there are a lot of different factors that will determine how much sleep that you actually need, not just your lifestyle, but genetics and a whole bunch of other things there too. Then we'll talk about the importance of cortisol, because the reality is that cortisol gets a bad rap when it really shouldn't. Chronically elevated cortisol is a problem, but without cortisol, we wouldn't really have any energy, wouldn't have stable blood sugar levels. And in the context of this talk here, we need cortisol to spike appropriately to set up the PM circadian rhythm patterns that enable us to get good sleep. So we're going to go into a little bit of that too, and how the cortisol and the melatonin actually kind of a positive feedback loops on each other and help both of them function better. Then we'll talk about kind of the overarching reasons about like why we are all, generally speaking, struggling with sleep and why we need to do something about it. And then we're going to go into like basic practices, supplementations, the actionable stuff that we can do once we kind of understand the geography of sleep. Then we're going to talk about like what do we actually do to make the improvements going forward there. So first off, let's just very quickly go over, why do we sleep? You know, why do we spend a third or somewhere between a third and half of our life unconscious? Kind of seems like a bit of a waste of time, really, doesn't it? But the reality is that sleep is a very, very active process that brings a lot to the table. After all, evolution wouldn't have dictated that just about every animal does it unless it does something important. So in the context of ourselves, these are the things that we're going to see going on. Now, the first thing that we really want to hone in on is the lymphatic and glymphatic drainage that happens while you sleep. So basically put, lymphatic system, think of it as like the waste disposal service system, whatever, for most of your body. So think like from the neck down, for example, right? And then we have the glymphatic system, which is the branch of the lymphatic system specifically for your brain. Okay, so that is what clears out your brain, cerebral tissue, and all that. So obviously very important. Both of those are incredibly active whilst we sleep. So it helps us to, should we say, detox anything that's built up during the day. Then we also have the sleep period being when most of our recovery happens. We all know that when we've been training hard, if our sleep is not great for whatever reason, we tend to be more sore, more stiff, not perform as well. This is because there are a lot of cascades that happen during sleep that stimulate tissue-based repair, especially things like growth hormone and things like that. So we know that if we want to recover well from whatever training or whatever our lives involves, then we probably need to be sleeping well. It is also where our immune system does a lot of its work, which, for example, is why you generally will crave sleep more when you're sick. It's because basically your body's way of forcing you to go into an environment where the immune system can function better to hopefully get you over whatever the thing is that you're dealing with. It's also incredibly important for memory and learning. So whilst we're awake, we don't actually create any long-term memory. So all the things that you maybe want to learn and take in throughout the day, none of that actually gets embedded whilst you're awake. You might take in the information, but it's kind of, should we say, it's in short-term memory. So only during sleep then that we are able to put that into long-term memory so that it can be recalled later on, and also so that we can make connections with existing memories so that we can kind of tie things together and be creative and all that type of thing. And then perhaps in terms of an overarching sense, when we're awake, we are generally in sympathetic mode, which is kind of like get up and do things. And we should probably put this on the whiteboard actually, so because it's going to get referred to a lot. And the terms kind of sound counterintuitive. Let's just see if I actually spell things correctly. So sympathetic is like get up and go. Okay, that's like do stuff, be motivated, expend energy, etc. Okay, which you wouldn't expect based on the name, because we associate sympathetic with being sad and wallowing and all that type of thing, right? And then we have parasympathetic, which is typically referred to as rest and digest. Okay, so most of the time when we're awake, for obvious reasons, we're kind of up here in sympathetic mode because we got stuff to do, right? But we, like everything in biology, very few things are good and bad. It's usually about balance. And, you know, considering we're in sympathetic mode most of the time, well, then sleep allows us to swap over to that parasympathetic state and achieve a kind of balance where we can resynthesize neurotransmitters, resensitize the receptors involved with being in the sympathetic state, all this sort of thing. So it's important. Let's just put it out at that, okay? Now let's look at how much sleep do we actually need to be getting. Now, there's a lot of different factors that go into this, okay? So let's first look at genetic differences. And you can kind of test this. I think the genes are, I might get this slightly wrong, so I apologize, but I think it's DEC2, PER3, and then the really easy one to remember is the clock gene, which is aptly named. Those numbers might be the wrong way around, so don't quote me on this. Basically, these three genes collectively actually determine a lot of your sleep architecture and your sleep need, kind of all else being equal, which you can get them genetically tested. For example, there's an allele of the clock gene that some individuals have where they actually perform at their best between like 4 and 5 hours of sleep. So like you will meet some people in your life who are like that. If they get 6, 7, 8, 9 hours of sleep, whatever, they actually function considerably worse. That's quite often down to deviations in that clock gene there. So that kind of sets the stage right from birth there. But then once we get past that, there's a lot of things that happen in sleep which just take time. So really the way that we want to think about the answer to the question, how much sleep do I need, is more like, how much time does my body need to do all the things that it needs to do that really only happen while I sleep? It's not a very catchy answer, I admit, but that's the way we should be looking at it. Because we have all these things going on, right? We've got synaptic pruning. So synaptic pruning is a really important process that makes sure that your brain doesn't remember things it doesn't have to and doesn't get too cluttered. After all, running a brain is pretty energetically expensive. And we don't want to be holding on to connections and synapses that we don't need. So synaptic pruning is the process of your body basically getting rid of synapses that it deems are not important. And if this didn't happen, well then we wouldn't have to think of it like emptying the camera roll on your phone or whatever, right? Like you go through it and if it's my phone, you've got like 2,500 pictures of your dogs doing the exact same thing, right? Well, if you never delete any of those, you haven't got any room for like cool pictures when you go to Disneyland to do something awesome that you really need to remember, right? So then you have to go through and sadly delete a couple of dog photos to make room for those really cool photos that you have to remember. So synaptic pruning is very important, even though it sounds negative. We have that glymphatic and lymphatic drainage that we talked about. So that's like all the waste products that we build up during the night or during the day, will get washed out there at night. We have the accumulation refreshing of adenosine. So we'll talk about adenosine a little bit later because adenosine is the pathway that caffeine acts on. So naturally we're all very interested in adenosine. So we'll go into that a little bit more. But basically adenosine just builds up throughout the day, makes you feel drowsy. It's one of the things that makes you feel like now is the time to unwind. But during the nighttime then is when we clear that adenosine and actually recycle it to make ATP, which is your cell's like energy source, right? And again, we can put that up here just in case we forget, because again, ATP will probably get mentioned a couple of times. All else being equal, ATP equals energy, which we like. So we want some more of that. So there's a whole bunch of things that, I mean, we can probably also put in there like tissue damage and things like that, right? Then there's your chronotype. So like you have a baseline that your body is kind of hardwired to based on your circadian rhythm that is your optimal sleep window. You know, some people might be like a 9 p.m. till 5 a.m. sleep or whatever. You have, now this is adaptable over time because like look at the average sleep schedule of a teenager compared to an adult, for example. So it is open to variability and change over time. But right now, at this moment in time, you have a chronotype, which is basically associated with sunset and sunrise and like what is the best time for you to sleep. If you're aligned with that chronotype, your sleep quality will be higher and your sleep requirement will therefore be lower because it's more restorative, right? If you are not aligned with that chronotype, say you're meant to be an early bird, right, but you're on night shifts, well then your sleep quality is going to drop and therefore your sleep requirement has to go up to kind of make up the lack of quality, which sadly does a pretty crappy job of that. Age will also come into this, right? So when you're young, we're talking like say 16 and below, your brain is growing at an alarming rate. So you have a lot of new synapses to create, a lot of new memories to store, proteins to fold, and all of this, which again happens primarily during deep sleep. So we need to sleep longer to create time for that. And this is why, for example, like if you're kind of like between the age of like 4 and 12, I think, you can spend up to about 50% of your night in REM sleep. And we'll go through the different stages in a little bit. So you need more sleep when you're young because your brain's got to do some growing, right? Then as we get older, now, what we'll generally find is that elderly people will sleep less on average, but their sleep requirement is actually higher. Because what happens as you get older, and we can talk about this a little bit later, your sleep architecture, which is basically how well your body sleeps and goes in and out of the phases and so on and so forth, deteriorates. And because of that, the average quality of your sleep drops. But for that exact same reason, you also have problems sleeping. So you sleep for less time, and your sleep quality gets worse. And there's stuff we can do about that, which we'll discuss. But again, this is why one of the reasons that elderly people might be more prone to feeling fatigued and tired, not have as much energy, and perhaps need to nap, okay? And then, you know, when you're an adult, you're kind of stuck in the middle there, like as average, right? Then we can also look at how much are we asking of our system, right? So let's say we're training really, really hard right now. We've got a whole bunch of muscle damage that we need to deal with. Well, that primarily gets dealt with during deep sleep. And if we have a lot of damage to repair, well, then we might need more deep sleep. So we might need more sleep cycles to allow us to actually deal with that, okay? It could be the same if you're a university student studying exams. Like if your brain is burning through a lot of resources, accumulating a lot of metabolites, well, you've got more stuff to clear out, so that's probably going to take longer, okay? And then last, of course, we have, which we've kind of mentioned already, like the quality of your sleep will in large determine then how much that you need. And whether you're getting enough is an interesting question, Rex. It will vary almost day to day, but the best indicator is probably going to be how you feel when you wake up. Like you should be waking up without an alarm. Like your alarm should be like the last resort. Like if I don't wake up by this time, like something's off, right? Your daytime and nighttime energy, like are you appropriately energetic during the day and then getting appropriately tired towards the end of the day? Your cognitive speed and all this type of thing is generally going to be a pretty good indicator of whether you're sleeping enough or whether the quality of that sleep is up to scratch. So let's look at a sleep cycle. Now, let's understand what we're dealing with. And this will help us kind of like burrow into like why sleep is important and like why missing any of it, whether it's the beginning or the end, is also kind of an issue, right? So we have 3 main stages to sleep. Now, technically there is a 4th stage, which is the first stage, N1, which is basically your transition from being conscious to unconscious. Doesn't take very long, or at least it shouldn't. If you experience like you're kind of going to sleep and like you jerk yourself awake, right? That's called a hypnic jerk. That happens during stage 1. I don't really know why that happens. It seems a bit counterintuitive, but that's an indicator that you just awoke from hypnic, from N1 sleep, okay? So we've gone through N1 sleep, now we are actually asleep. So we spend about 50% of our total sleep time in N1, which is light sleep, which for a long time was kind of just like scooted over. Like it's just the thing that prepares you for deep and REM sleep, which actually do the important stuff. And that's semi-true, but there's something very important that happens during light sleep, and that is sleep spindles, which is a term given to like bursts of cerebral activity, which is basically your brain moving memories that you've accumulated throughout the day from the short-term memory, should we say, which is at the front, cerebral, and into the cortex. So from cerebellum to cortex, okay? Now, if we don't do that, we don't get the memories from over here, short-term storage, into the cortex, deep and REM sleep can't do their thing, which we'll talk about in a sec, which embeds them into long-term memory. So it's actually really very important, because without that, memory formation couldn't really happen. We need to take it from short-term to long-term, right? Now, sorry, I misspoke there. It's hippocampus that the short-term memories are. So I should have looked at my own notes. Now, so then we kind of question like, well, why else would this be there? Now, in reality, this exists as like an evolutionary mechanism, right? So we need to think back, and this is also relevant for the chronotypes, right? Because if we go back here, with the chronotypes, there are some people, you know, most are going to align around average between sunset and sunrise, and then there'll be a phase in between there where like some might be an hour or two this way, some might be an hour or two that way. But then there are others who are complete night owls, okay? They exist. They're generally less than 10% of the population. But why would they exist? Why would that be advantageous? And you think like, well, when we kind of evolutionarily developed, we lived in tribes and we were not the top of the food chain. Like we ate things, but things also ate us. So when it comes to sleeping, if you're sleeping as a group, it's probably good that not everyone is asleep at the same time. So like your night owls here, which again are a pretty small part of the population, well, they were your night watchmen. They were the people that kept the tribe safe whilst the majority of them slept. And similarly then, people would, of the majority, say the 80 to 90%, some would fall asleep here, some would fall asleep in a little bit, and there would be a phasing in and out of the group, okay? Which basically meant more people were alert at one time, hopefully. Now, light sleep serves a similar purpose, because let's say, you know, we're in a group and our night watchman is doing a very poor job, right? Or they've encountered something that they can't deal with on their own. Well, if like say half of our tribe, because we spend about half of our time in light sleep, are now very easy to wake up, well, any kind of like audible noise that's kind of out of the norm will wake up half the tribe and they can go and help out with the thing, right? Whatever the thing is. So that's why we have light sleep. It is there to prep you for deep and REM sleep, but very importantly, helps us take memories from the hippocampus into the cortex so that they can then later be brought into long-term memory. This is also why power naps work, okay? Like say you're a student who's studying and is trying to take in a lot of information. During that little power nap, you can take some of those memories from the hippocampus into the cortex and free up a little bit more space so that you can learn more afterwards, okay? Then we go into deep sleep. So this would be N3. Now, all being well, we want about 20 to 25% of our total sleep to be made up of deep sleep. Now, deep sleep gets front-loaded at the beginning of the night, which we'll look at a graphic about that in a moment, right? So first, say 3 to 4 hours of your night is going to be where most of your deep sleep happens. Now, this is very important. So think of deep sleep as like the power washer or the cleansing period for your brain, right? This is where the glymphatic system really does its job. Now, I think it's about 10 times more active during deep sleep than it is at any other moment. And this is super cool, right? Because basically what happens during deep sleep is your brain cells actually shrink. Now, I know some of us don't have much room to shrink there, but it does happen, right? And because of that shrinkage, more cerebral spinal fluid will leach into your brain because now there's space for it to get in, and that will basically wash out all of the metabolites and things that we want to get rid of, especially all of the nasty things that you hear about with relation to like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. We're talking like beta amyloid plaques, tau proteins, all that kind of nasty stuff that builds up in there. This is when that happens in deep sleep. So we've got cerebral spinal fluid going into the brain, leaching out all the horrible stuff and carrying that away. It's also when your lymphatic system is also extremely active. The other thing that happens in deep sleep is this is where you're going to get the majority of your growth hormone spikes. And I know if we hear growth hormone, we're like, ooh, okay, tell me more, right? But this is what's going to spark most of your tissue recovery. Those growth hormone spikes are going to trigger all those healing cascades. So if we're lacking on this, and obviously our recovery from whatever physical trauma that our training or any anything else have put on our body is going to be much slower, okay? This is also where we clear that adenosine that we'll speak about a little bit later. So again, that just builds up during the day and makes you feel drowsy. This is where that adenosine is cleared and then recycled into ATP so that we can wake up the next morning with hopefully no adenosine in our system, which means we feel alert and ready to go, right? This is also where we've put all of our memories into the cortex from the day, right? Declarative memories think of them as memories that have no emotion attached to them. So you think like you're trying to remember someone's phone number or like a street address or something like that, very factual based memories. This is where they get embedded in the deep sleep. So again, kind of like half of our memory consolidation is done in deep, half is done in REM. And this is also where the preparatory work for that synaptic pruning process takes part. So this is kind of like, if we use my really bad camera roll analogy, this would be where you're kind of going through and clicking all the ones that you want to delete, but you don't delete them yet. You're just highlighting the synapses that actually are not useful, maybe don't need to be maintained and can be cut out later on. That's deep sleep. So lots of cleaning, healing, and declarative memories, factual memories being embedded. Then we move on to REM sleep. So this one, again, all being well, would make up about 20 to 25% of our total sleep. This gets backloaded. So we have deep at the front, REM at the back. Okay, so like think of it as like if you go to bed too late, you miss out on deep sleep. If you wake up too early, you miss out on REM sleep. So there's issues in both directions here, okay? Now, this is where a lot of our creativity and our ability to problem solve comes in. So basically what happens during REM sleep, which is really quite unique and quite cool, your amygdala, which is kind of right in the core of your brain, it's like your emotion center. It's probably the best way to talk about it, right? So that basically dies down entirely. So you become emotionless during REM sleep. And why this happens is it allows you then to process memories free of emotion. So let's say, for example, you have an argument with your partner in the afternoon. You go to bed that night and you sleep. The REM sleep allows you to process that memory free of the amygdala and also free of noradrenaline. So this is the time when noradrenaline goes right down, which is noradrenaline is like an activating neurotransmitter, right? So your brain is really unemotional and very chilled, would be the really unscientific way of describing this, okay? So you're really unemotional, you're really chilled. So it allows you to process these perhaps emotional memories in an unemotional state, in an objective manner, so you can strip away the emotion from them and kind of see them for what they really are. So if we didn't have this process, we'd essentially all have PTSD, because like, let's say something happened to you yesterday that was really upsetting. Every time you remembered it, it would be just as upsetting as the time that it happened. Like that would be a terrible way to live. So this is where that happens. But the other thing that also happens here is this is where new connections are made. So when you are creating these new synapses, new memories, this is where you're kind of connecting the dots and saying like, oh, this is linked to this. So again, perhaps really bad example, right? But like you're driving home from work and a road that has been shut for ages is now open because the roadworks are finished, right? You clock that it's now open. Now, maybe your gym is kind of an easy way to get to your gym would be to drive down that road and like take a right or whatever. That would be a quicker route than you've been able to take recently because of the road work. When you're asleep in REM sleep, this would be where those connections are made. Like, oh, if that road is now open, I could go down that road and cut my journey time in half to the gym, because if I go down there, you get the point, right? So this is also where creativity comes from, because creativity is not necessarily the ability to magically come up with things. It's the ability to make connections between perhaps abstract ideas, okay? And like we kind of already hinted at, this is also where synaptic pruning happens. So in the deep sleep, we kind of go, that's useless, that's useless, that's useless, let's get rid of that. And then it's during REM sleep that we actually then go and cut those connections, right? So all of these, very important. And this is what it looks like when we put that together in a chart of someone's night's sleep. Now, this is an oddly impressive night of sleep, right? There was this tiny little brief awakening here. If any of you wear like an Oura ring like I've got on or whatever else, like you're going to have way more awakenings than that. So don't worry if you see that. But the main thing I want you to get from this is like we fall asleep here. This is N1, where we can experience those hypnic jerks that wake us back up. Here we have deep sleep. And as we can see, deep, deep, deep diminishes as the night goes on, whereas REM grows. And now the unfortunate thing is, let's say like this is 10 p.m. and this is 6 p.m. It's not a case of like, if I go to bed at midnight, my sleep cycle now just starts here. If you go to bed at midnight, you start here, right? So you've lost this big chunk of deep sleep here, right? You can't get that back, okay? So you miss that. So this would be the problem with going to bed too late, right? Similarly, let's say we wake up early, we're up for like an hour, and then we want to go back to bed to catch up on sleep, which kind of exists, but kind of doesn't, right? Well, then we would cut off our sleep, say here, miss this giant chunk of REM, and then when we go back to sleep, if we're only asleep for 2 hours, we're probably going to be right back here. So then we just miss out on REM sleep, or a large proportion of. So like, I'm not saying don't catch up on sleep or don't nap or whatever if that happens, but it's not the same, and we just need to be aware of that, right? So this is why getting that full window of sleep is important, because there are certain things that only happen at certain stages of that sleep cycle. Okay, so now let's look at the importance of cortisol. Everyone loves a good ChatGPT derived graphic, right? You're welcome, right? So I might try and draw this a little bit better on the whiteboard. This is where you'll see that I definitely should never have gone to art school. So we got like a graph like this. All right, so this would be high, this would be low, okay? And then this is gonna be your night sleep. So let's say this is like 6 a.m. here. Well, let's say we're a 6 a.m. waker, okay? That's our normal rhythm. Cortisol is gonna start low, and it's gonna start spiking just before our wake up time, because cortisol coming up is actually what wakes you up. Cortisol also, you can't really dissociate cortisol and adrenaline. When cortisol goes up, adrenaline goes up. So cortisol goes up, adrenaline comes up with it, you're awake, okay? And then within the first like hour or two of waking, your adrenaline and cortisol get about as high as they're gonna get in the day, right? And then they kind of peak and gradually come down. And then let's say this is like 10 p.m. down here. This might be our sleep time. They should get pretty low again then by the time we go to sleep. This would be our cortisol. Remember, cortisol is like the gives you energy and motivation thing, right? But then we also have melatonin, which is kind of like the opposite side of the coin here. Now that doesn't just magically spike when we go to sleep or like just before. Melatonin should start rising several hours before, because melatonin is not just makes you fall asleep like that. Melatonin's role is to kick off all the other cascades that lead to you sleeping. So it's kind of like the on switch that allows all the cogs to start turning that later then cause you to sleep. It's not like a light switch, okay? So what we would want to see then would be kind of melatonin would be super low. Let's do this as like a little dotted line here. And then once we start getting closer to our bedtime, say this is like, I don't know, 6 p.m. here, something just to match that there. Maybe at 6 p.m. this starts spiking, and then we get a nice big spike here, and then that will peak and slowly start to come down then during the night, okay? Now, the interesting thing about these two mechanisms, these two waves, is that they actually feed into each other. They positively reinforce each other. So when one goes wrong, the other one goes wrong. When one goes right, the other one goes right. The most common, and this probably wouldn't be what we expect, but the most common problem we see is that this doesn't get high enough. Like your morning cortisol should be high, because when that happens, we see a proper dip. And when we get a proper dip, we can get a proper spike in melatonin. If this doesn't happen as it's supposed to, then we get this kind of like, this goes up to here, and then it kind of flattens out, and then it doesn't drop fast enough. So then let's say cortisol ends up being higher here than it should be. Well, that stops this melatonin rise. So now melatonin doesn't spike as it should. It kind of does this, and it kind of ends up mirroring what the cortisol does. So like both of them kind of flatten out. So then the problem is, well, this person here is groggy in the day and then not sleeping well in the night. So this becomes a whole like kind of like downward spiral of like, feel like crap, don't sleep very well, probably feel worse, and so on and so forth, right? So I'm not saying this is everyone, but in many cases, we actually need to focus on getting this up higher to get a proper spike, but also allowing it to drop more significantly. The reason we're all kind of here is that we're spending way too much time in sympathetic mode, okay? Now this is mainly a societal lifestyle thing, right? Like, we are doing a lot of things in our day that very heavily stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, considerably more so than in the environments that these systems basically developed in. So, even just the lighting that you're in, like pretty much all artificial lighting is blue light dominant. You can have your own opinion about why that is, but blue light is obviously associated with daytime sunlight. So it has the effect of like increasing dopamine and increasing sympathetic activation. So even just being in artificial light alone is going to make sympathetic activation go up. Then we have the fact that, we're very busy people, right? We do have a lot of work. We generally have quite a lot of stress. We're worrying about a lot of things. Anything that releases cortisol, i.e. stress, will make sympathetic activation go up. Then we kind of have like our lifestyle feeds into that. Like the average person is going to go to work most of the day, and then they get home in the evening and it's like, well, I haven't actually had any time to myself to do the things I actually like doing. Like, I'm not going to sit down and just meditate for 2 hours and go to sleep, like maybe physiologically would be the best thing to do. I want to do stuff. I want to have some fun, spend time with my family, whatever, right? Maybe we train at that time. All of that's going to drive up sympathetic activation. Most of us are chest breathers, right? We're up here, shallow breathing, chest rising, right? That again is going to increase sympathetic activation because you're not clearing CO2 properly from your lungs. Your heart rate is going to be higher, your oxygenation is going to be lower. So you're going to bring up sympathetic activation so that your heart rate stays higher, so that you actually clear enough carbon dioxide and provide enough oxygen to your lungs. Nasal breathing will bring that down, for example. So there's a whole load of factors going into this that mean that we're pretty much stuck in the sympathetic state all the time. And what this does over time is it gives us this pattern here, this flatter pattern. We don't spike it because we're not sensitive. If we think about it, it's not as simple as this, right? But if we say the main driver behind sympathetic activation is cortisol. It's not that simple, but let's just go with that model for now. If we're constantly pounding that system, it desensitizes, right? So because it's not sensitive anymore, we can't get the crazy spike that we really want in the morning. But then we're just kind of hammering it all day at low level with the lighting, the social media, whatever, video games at night. It doesn't really matter. Like, I'm not saying any of these things are inherently bad, right? But they don't have the desired effect to be conducive to sleep. So then we end up just hammering it, and it just kind of stays here. And this will then continue and stay high whilst you sleep. And if this is you, this profile, like, you're going to be someone who's incredibly easy to wake up, because basically there's like a little threshold here, right? Where like once cortisol goes above and adrenaline goes above a certain point, like, you're awake. So if your baseline is already high, it doesn't take much to kind of push you over that edge and go from sleep to wake, right? Again, it's not perfectly that simple, but we need to understand what we're dealing with here. So what can we do? So getting good sleep is a two-phase process. It's phasic, okay? We need to anchor this and anchor this. We need to do the right things at the right time. It's not just a case of like, I go to bed at the right time anymore. So when we're looking at this here, right, this AM cortisol spike, there are things we can do there. Now remember, cortisol's main job is to make sure that energy is readily available. So it controls blood sugar, is a big part of its job, right? So what could we do here? Well, first off, let's say we take the typical kind of example of like, I wake up and have a bowl of cereal, huge bolus of carbs. What happens to blood sugar? Blood sugar shoots up. Well, if blood sugar is super high, cortisol doesn't need to be high, because blood sugar is already too high, if anything. Cortisol will go down, insulin will go up, so on and so forth, right? So that's going to blunt. And I'm not saying eat zero carbs, right? But we just need to be aware of the mechanisms here. So perhaps our breakfast is lower carb so that we can keep blood sugar semi-low and allow that cortisol spike to keep riding up. This would also be a good time to bring up our body temperature. Anything that brings up our body temperature is going to aid this, okay? Mainly because bringing up your body temperature actually requires you doing something, either in terms of burning energy, or let's say we do cold plunge. I know that sounds really counterintuitive. Why on earth would I do cold plunge when I want to elevate my body temperature? But this is why. You go into a cold plunge, or you just have a cold shower. It doesn't need to be one of those fancy ice baths or anything, right? What happens? Your body gets very cold very fast. What does your body do to counter that? It will increase the pathways, whatever. It does more of all the things that increase heat production in your body. So then you get out the ice bath. Those things don't just turn off. Your core body temperature is going to keep going up once it's recovered from the cold exposure, right? So that is one of the many reasons that cold exposure wakes people up and makes them feel really good. Again, I'm not saying you should do it, and it's kind of like an ace card. I wouldn't suggest playing all the time, but that's one of the reasons that this works. Adrenaline and dopamine will go up, core body temperature will rise, okay? Another thing we could do here would be to get sunlight exposure, like as early in the day as we can. That's going to, again, reinforce that circadian rhythm. Your body knows what time it is by the wavelengths of light that are coming into your eye. Like they change throughout the day as the sun changes position in the sky. You get sunlight exposure into your eyes early into the day, well then it's going to associate that with this is morning, it's time to get up and go. If you're an early riser, well then you can kind of get around that by buying like a 10,000 plus LUX light, like a really bright light. You can kind of put that on in the morning and that can act as a really good substitute for sunlight if you are an early riser, okay? So there's all this type of stuff we can do there. And then really, if we think about cortisol and adrenaline being like the readiness, right? This state, sympathetic, being the go, 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 this would ideally be the time that you do the hardest thing in your day. Now, maybe that's your workout, right? It could be. It could also be like the most cognitively demanding part of your day. Because remember, this also speeds up processing speed. So like everything runs faster. The main reason that you have more power output when adrenaline is high is because that neuronal process of transmission signaling is higher and faster, right? So it could also be like, if you're studying or whatever, that would be the time to do it. Whatever is going to cognitively challenge you the most, that would be what you do here. For example, like I'm writing my third book right now. Writing is not something that comes particularly naturally to me. Like I wouldn't say I'm a writer as such. This is where I do that because it is the absolute hardest thing. It makes my brain work. And then I generally am more productive for the rest of the day compared to the idea of like waking up and easing yourself in is really kind of a false economy. Okay. So then what do we do about this end of the spectrum? Okay. It's kind of the opposite, as you can imagine, right? So first off, we really, to get melatonin high, we need to think about it as getting cortisol low. So how do we get this downward slope, right? Well, first off, blue light, we need to block as much of that as possible, as we've already discussed. Blue light, sympathetic activation. So let's try and blunt that as much as we can. Could be the lighting that you're using, screen exposure, a whole bunch of things, right? We want to start doing less things that are demanding, right? If the job of cortisol is to make energy readily available, then the more energy we're expending, whether it's cognitive or physical, the higher cortisol has to be to make sure we're actually able to do that, right? So this would be the time to start unwinding physically less demanding activities, cognitively less demanding activities as well. And now remember, blood sugar being low is conducive to cortisol being high. So blood sugar being higher is going to be conducive to cortisol coming down. So this might be a case where, and again, there's always going to be individual variance, right? But like our relative intake of carbohydrates might do this throughout the day and increase. They might be lower in the morning to allow that cortisol spike. And as we get towards the evening, then we can have higher carb meals to allow the blood sugar to be higher and the cortisol to come down, okay? And then we could also, how do we decrease body temperature? Well, obviously we've got our cold exposure here. That could be as simple as like adjusting the AC in your house, not doing anything physically demanding, maybe spending a little bit of time outside, you know, if you don't live in like Arizona and it's 1,000 degrees all the time or whatever. All of these things can, even a hot shower can help because of the exact same process we spoke about with the cold exposure. You get into a hot shower, your body goes, oh, this is way too hot, activates all those mechanisms that help shed body heat. You get out of the hot shower, those mechanisms keep working, your core body temperature drops down. So what would our perfect morning routine look like? Okay, this is one of our dogs, Macy here. People never believe us when we say that they do red light therapy, but they do. This is a little panel here, like a raised platform next to one of our windows. Either one of them or both of them will go up there and bark at us or whine or whatever until we put it on, and then they're very happy, okay? So red light therapy is a great thing to do upon waking. Obviously, red light is associated with both sunrise and sunset. The reason that we put this upon waking is because this is a good thing. Most of the red light devices you have access to are very strong. But that's a good thing because most of us are massively deficient in red light, there's nothing special about it as such. It's just the fact that we're all deficient in it. So then when we add it in, good things happen, okay? Because they're very strong, we're better off using them in the morning because some people will find them stimulatory in a good way. If you wanted to do red light at night, you totally could, but you wouldn't use such a powerful source. Like this is why, for example, like a fireplace or like candlelight or something like that will make you feel drowsy, right? Because the red light in that scenario will be like sedative. In this scenario, when it's brighter, it will be stimulatory. So just a random one on there. We might also do what fancy geeky term, right? Neuroplastic work is just a term for like something that challenges your brain to get better at something, right? So like there's a whole bunch of like cool apps now where like you log into them and like it gives you all the stuff you're really bad at. Like you do a couple of different games, maybe there's like math and spelling and grammar or whatever, right? And like it goes, you suck at math. So then it gives you loads of math problems and stuff like that. That's a good thing. Okay, I use the Elevate app, most of my clients do, in case you're interested in just like one to get you going. So something that challenges our brain to make new connections or do something it's very poor at would be a good thing here because again, we want to do our cognitively demanding work in this stage. As soon as possible in the day then, we might get out and get our sunlight exposure. The thing with this, and I'm not trying to sell red light to you, but just as an example, this kind of red light exposure will give you a more gentle wake up. You know, remember when you were a teenager and you slept in too late, right? And your mom just comes in or whatever, like opens the curtains at 11 a.m. and like the sun feels like it's burning you alive. Like that kind of can happen, right? Especially with our like really bright artificial light. What this generally does is makes you feel awake kind of smoother. But then once the sun is up, maybe we go outside and get some blue light exposure. I'm going to limit how much tinfoil hat stuff we go over here on purpose, but this would be a good time to go out and do some grounding because grounding allows you to get electron donation from the earth. It allows you to shed a lot of the positive electrons that you've probably accumulated overnight by having electronics and stuff like that next to you. We can go over that later if you wish. And then perhaps in the first couple of hours of our day, then we go and do our training session. We keep our breakfast reasonably low in carbs. Probably also a good time to consume any stimulants that we're planning on consuming that day. Because again, if we get halfway through our day and then we spike cortisol up super high, well, then we know what that's going to do. That's going to suppress that melatonin spike and then things are going to go haywire. Okay? And then throughout the day, probably a good idea to go out and just get some sun every now and then so that your body knows what time it is, for want of a better way of putting it. Then what about in the evening? So one thing I would put out here for this is, whilst going to bed and waking up, etc., at a similar time is kind of important. When it comes to like unwinding and going to sleep, in my opinion, what kind of matters more is actually having a stable structure to get you in the mindset of going to sleep. Like there's no point saying, right, I'm in bed every night at 9 p.m., but then like you're playing a really stressful video game level or something like until 10 to 9 and you're like, but I'm in bed at 9. It's like, and like you're wired and you're pissed off because you just threw your controller at the TV or whatever, right? So like, I would look at it more as like, what is the series of steps I need to do to get me in a good parasympathetic state so that I can then fall asleep? If I'm going to bed an hour later or an hour earlier, okay, whatever, but like, are you actually going to sleep well once you're there? That's important. So what can we do here? Well, first off, let's try and block out any blue light that we can, because remember, again, that's going to be stimulatory. So it might be a case of just like dimming the lights in your house, having less on. You might get fancy like infrared bulbs. Like we have infrared bulbs in our bedroom, for example, so we don't have any blinding light there. It might just be a case of like dimming them, or wearing blue light blocking glasses, for example, would be a great thing to do a couple of hours before you sleep, okay? We probably want to start then cutting out any stimuli that like make us think of the outside world. And I know that sounds a bit like woo-woo-y, right? But like, we probably don't want to be worrying about the news or social media or your job or whatever else as we're trying to get into this parasympathetic state here. Like anything that's going to stress you out or cause you anxiety is going to stop you from doing that. So it's probably a good time to just kind of like be where you're at and not get your attention drawn outward. This would also be when we want to start bringing our core body temperature down. So for those of you that maybe live in a warm climate, it might be a good time to start bringing down the temperature of your house. For the vast majority of people, their best sleep is going to happen between 64 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Obviously, there's some variance there, but that's a good place to be. And we probably want to start managing our food and fluid intake. So we said here, as we get to the evening, we probably want something high, relatively high in carbs, whatever your diet allows for, to help bring the blood sugar up and the cortisol down. But we probably don't want to eat that like 30 minutes before we go to bed, right? Because food goes in the system, heat gets dissipated, heart rate goes up, all things that are going to push us towards sympathetic state. So maybe that last meal is like 2 to 3 hours before we go to bed, and then we're going to start titrating down our fluid intake so that we're not waking up every hour and a half to go to the bathroom, right? Then maybe an hour before we go to sleep, something like that, we might go outside and get moonlight exposure. Again, light basically tells your body what's going on. Moonlight has its own wavelengths of light that sends a signal to the body, this is nighttime. Maybe this, and this is something that a lot of people will get wrong, this might be a good time to take melatonin. If you take melatonin to help supplement this spike here. Now, the reason a lot of people don't get on with melatonin is because they basically take it as they're going to sleep. Now, remember what I said earlier, looking at this kind of terrible diagram, admittedly, that melatonin is kind of like the master switch that kicks off all the processes that we're interested in. It's not going to put you to sleep straight away. It starts all the cascades. So if you take that as you're laying down in bed, well, it's doing something far too late at that point, right? Whereas you probably want to take it an hour, maybe an hour and a half before. Different people will metabolize it at different rates. For example, I'm incredibly fast metabolizer of melatonin. I can take it and within 15 minutes, I'm like a nodding dog, right? But the average person, it's going to be like an hour to 90 minutes, okay? Just before we kind of lay down to sleep then or go to bed, this might be a time when we take our other sleep supplements that are, should we say, more fast acting than melatonin. It might also be a good time to do some kind of practice that puts us in a very parasympathetic state, so very chilled out, maybe in a good mood, appreciative. So like, this could be where you do some kind of journaling, gratitude, meditation. You know, everyone's going to have their own kind of idea of what that looks like, but some kind of practice that brings your awareness and your attention to the here and now, no external sources, and also puts you in quite a relaxed state, which could be a lot of things, breath work and so on and so forth, okay? This could also be a good time, especially if you're quite a naturally anxious person, or maybe you are feeling overwhelmed or stressed about a lot of the things that have happened that day. Might be a place where you bring in the vagus nerve massage. So vagus nerve massage is kind of like the master switch for your parasympathetic nervous system. We can massage it and get that nerve to activate and really kick us into a parasympathetic state. There are quite a lot of like devices out there now that claim to do this for you. Personally, I have never seen them work nearly as well as someone who's just practiced this and does it on themselves. Like there's endless YouTube videos and kind of takes on it. If you like, just pick one and go with it. But if you get good at this, you'll get to a point where you get like a sympathetic sigh response. You literally get like a type response, and that's it really kicking in. If you can get to that point, then you'll be very, very unwound and parasympathetic. So that, especially if you struggle falling asleep or you're naturally an anxious person, that is something definitely worth investing in learning. So what about our sleep environment? Okay, so we already mentioned that it's important to allow core body temperature to drop down. That's a key part of getting into that parasympathetic state, okay? Now, so for most, that's going to be between 64 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, remember, people are going to vary in terms of like whether they're hot or a cold sleeper. But this remains true in terms of ambient temperature for all of them. Okay, so like for me and Naomi are a great example of this, right? I am about as hot sleepers come. Like even in the middle of winter, I will have a fan on and maybe a sheet. Okay, and I'm still like too hot at times. Her, on the other hand, her and the dogs have created what I can only call an impenetrable fortress of duvets and pillows, right? Like they're huddled in this thermal igloo, okay? But if we have the house temperature outside of this range, both of us sleep worse. So it's the ambient temperature is more like a signal to your body that like now is the time in which you sleep. Doesn't necessarily matter about your own personal kind of thermodynamics because you can adjust what you used to sleep with based on that, but getting that ambient temperature down. And you know, If you are in a situation like we are, then you have all sorts of like cool devices now that can even like cool or heat the mattress for you to like help achieve the desired ambient temperature so that you can sleep optimally. Like that's probably a big deal. We get by the way we are, but that's going to be quite important for a lot of people. And we'll talk about sharing a bed in a sec. We obviously want it to be as dark and quiet as possible. This wouldn't have been that important as when we evolved, but now we live in an environment with a lot of ambient noise and a lot of ambient light. Even in in the middle of the night, there could be cars going past, street lights, etc. So we need to make sure that everything is as dark and quiet as humanly possible. We also want it to be free from things that are going to pull our awareness away from sleeping, right? Bedroom is for two things. It's for sleeping and right? So we don't want to have like our work laptop and like our phone and all that type of stuff. Anything that's going to make us think like, oh man, did I email that guy back? Or what's this happening tomorrow? Like anything that's going to pull you away from where you are now is not going to be conducive to sleeping well. Again, we'll try and manage the tinfoil hat stuff a little bit, but managing EMF is pretty important when it comes to getting quality sleep, especially in terms of deep and REM. And again, I'll try to like not go into this too much, but basically all the electronic devices in your house, even the wiring in the wall behind your bed, which is why you shouldn't technically have the bed against the wall, will be giving off positive electrons, which get donated to you and make you more positively charged. This, generally speaking, like to simplify, is going to put you in like a more inflamed state. It also changes the brain waves that you experience whilst you sleep. All of this to say that when that's happening, you don't sleep or get as good deep and REM sleep as you could. So that, that could be a case of like, where you don't have any electronics in your room, you don't have your phone in your bedroom, you pull your bed away from the wall. You could do basic things like that. If you want to go a little bit step further, you have devices like this. This is an Aries Tech AIRES. This is actually the one I have next to your bed. Basically, it's an EMF blocker. So basically stops all of those positive electrons and the waveforms interacting with you and disrupting your sleep. You also have devices like that. I've got one on under my t-shirt here, which does a very similar thing. That can make quite a big difference. And when we put that next to our bed, my deep and REM sleep went up about 3 or 4% on average, just from putting that little thing next to our bed. So it can make a big impact if you want to start going down that type of rabbit hole. Okay. Then we've got what to do if you're sharing a bed. So like if you go to like Northern Europe, Scandinavia, for example, and you go into like a hotel or an Airbnb or whatever, you've got a double bed, there will always be 2 blankets or 2 duvets on the bed. Because in their culture, it's just commonly accepted that when you are sleeping in the same bed with someone, you don't share a blanket or a sheet or whatever. And the reason for that is because it does negatively affect the quality of your sleep. When you've got someone on the same sleep, like a mattress as you, and when they move, something in connection with you also moves, it will disrupt your sleep, make you more likely to wake up, mean that you spend longer in light sleep because your body will perceive those perturbations as like a minor threat. So it won't allow you to fall into deep and REM sleep as easily, okay? So if you are sharing a bed with someone, then if you don't have a very firm mattress where like you can kind of not feel each other moving around, then you might at least want to look at like sharing a duvet or like not sharing a duvet, having separate ones or whatever, so that when one moves, the other person isn't as perturbed by that, okay? Like in our example, I have a sheet, Naomi has her impenetrable igloo, right? Very separate, works very well. And then also it's worth looking into just really ingraining nasal breathing. Obviously, like snoring and sleep apnea are hugely common problems now, right? And even in people that don't have thick necks, big builds, or any of the predispositions to sleep apnea or snoring, like blocked nasal passages, etc. And most of that is down to the fact that we're all chronic mouth breathers. And then when you fall asleep, what do you think you do? Well, you use the same breathing pattern that you do at night, in the day. So now you mouth breathe at night and you end up snoring and maybe even having sleep apnea because that's what you do in the day. Remember, mouth breathing is associated with sympathetic state. So ingraining nasal breathing throughout the day can be a very, very good tool for this. This is why people get benefit from wearing mouth tape when they go to bed, for example. So like for me, I was a really bad snorer for like no apparent reason. Nobody could really figure that out. But when I started wearing mouth tape, it just freaked me the hell out. It was like, this is weird. I can't fall asleep with this, right? So this is just an N of 1 example, right? In case it's useful. I just started wearing mouth tape to do all my workouts. And it's like, well, if I can train with mouth tape on when my heart rate is whatever, even on the assault bike, you know, it's like 160, 170, whatever it is, right? If I can do that, then I can probably sleep with it on. And, you know, after a while, that got rid of the like weird factor, and now I could fall asleep with the mouth tape on. That was great. So that stopped the snoring. Like the first night I woke up and it's like, oh, I breathed through my nose all night and I didn't die. That's kind of reassuring, right? So now it's at the point where I don't need the mouth tape because I've ingrained the nasal breathing to the point where now I don't need it to enforce it, right? So now I don't snore. Kind of cool. But so like that, there's going to be more people that struggle with that than you think. And even if you're not aware of it, your partner might be. So like it might be worth asking them what's going on there. Okay, I'm going to kind of move on to supplementation and that type of thing now. So the first thing I want to address is the very stereotypical mid-afternoon crash. And like most of you should know what I mean when I say that because it's incredibly common, okay? So like this is where a lot of people go wrong. Like when we had that little graphic up here, you know, they get through most of the day pretty well, the cortisol spike, and then they get halfway through the day and they experience this and they're like reaching for stimulants or whatever it might be. Then they screw up their circadian rhythm from that point on because they put something very stimulating into the system too late in the day. Now, this has really, really common sort of like causes that we can fix pretty easy. So first off, let's try and tick some of these off for you. So first off, let's look at nutrition, right? Now, it could just be that you haven't eaten anything. This is super common, okay? It's like, well, I don't really take a lunch break because I'm too busy, or like, you know, I just get lost in meetings or whatever. It's like, well, the reason you're tired is because your brain doesn't have any fuel, right? And we've put that on there. So like, your brain has 4 fuels that it can use, okay? We have oxygen, which I would hope you're all kind of dealing with pretty well. We have glucose. We have ketones, and we have acetylcholine, which is abbreviated to ACH, okay? Let's say you've gone, you've eaten breakfast or whatever, and now it's like 2 p.m. and you're tired. You feel like you need to pick me up, right? Well, sure, you've been breathing, so that's a start, good for you. But like, you still don't have any actual substrate to use to create ATP for all the workload that your brain is doing, right? So it needs one of these at least, okay? Obviously glucose would come from your lunch potentially, but we need to be careful. Remember, like we still want cortisol kind of up there, just not super high. So like if we put too much glucose into the system, that tanks, which is the other common problem, okay? So like, but I eat lunch. It's like, yes, you do. But your lunch was like carbs plus carbs. So then your cortisol goes because your blood sugar is super high. Of course, now you feel tired. The problem is now you've tanked your cortisol. So you're like, cool, I've eaten lunch. I feel tired. I'm going to drink a Monster. And you can imagine how that goes, right? So glucose, but the correct amount of glucose. You don't need a crazy amount to keep you going, right? Could be in the form of ketones, which, you know, I put here. 2 most common brands of ketones like Ketone IQ and Ketone Aid. There's no such thing as bad ketones, right? They all kind of work. They just process slightly differently in the body. Like the ketone salts have to go through the liver and bounce off that and so on and so forth, right? But they all work. Some people just respond slightly better to others. So ketones could come in there because they are literally like a direct neurological fuel source. Like think of them as going straight to your brain for fuel, right? Like ketones get a bad rap because they were marketed really badly as like this like really weird fat loss aid that was like a massive gimmick, and that part of it really was a gimmick. You can't just drink ketones to be in ketosis and so on and so forth, but as a neurological fuel source, they're fantastic, okay? And then we look at acetylcholine. Like, how can we bump that up? Well, as the name kind of suggests, acetylcholine is made in large part from choline. So you could take any form of choline supplementation here would work. Alpha GPC, citicoline, CDP choline, all those type of things would work really well here to give your brain fuel to keep doing the things that you want to do. For example, like before Dave and I do a lot of the podcasts, it'll be shot of ketones and alpha GPC and stuff like that pretty commonly to make sure our brain has enough fuel to hopefully hold a meaningful conversation for several hours, okay? So there's that. Lack of cerebral fuel, or maybe eating too many carbs and tanking your cortisol. This is another really important one, eye strain, okay? So most of us have jobs or spend our day looking at something that is very close, right? When you do that, okay, so your eye, let's say this is your eye. When you're looking at something that's very close, you have muscles around your eye that control the shape of your eye, which adjusts how like light refracts and bounces around there when you're looking at things, right? It allows you to focus on objects. If we're staring at something that's, say, like 2 foot away from us at all times, let's say these are muscles 1 and 2, just for argument's sake, right? And it's never this simple, but we're going to go with this analogy because I have to understand it too, right? Let's say muscles 1 and 2 are responsible for contracting to put your eye in a shape that makes you good at focusing on something that's very close. What happens if you did an isometric contraction for like 4 hours straight? You're going to get pretty tired, right? And this is where a lot of concentration loss comes from. These muscles get fatigued. Your eye actually struggles to focus on the object that you're looking at. And because of that, you can't take in any information. So the absolute best thing you can do here is go outside and look at stuff as far away as humanly possible and like try to make out details. Like we're in gym at elitefts, we have a wall and the opposite side there is made up of millions of photographs, it seems like. You would just stand here and try to make out the smallest possible details on those photographs, or like in that tree in the distance. It doesn't matter. Because basically what happens then is, let's say muscles 3 and 4 now are the muscles that are responsible for changing the shape of your eye to look at that thing far away. That means 1 and 2 can relax. So 1 and 2 get a break. They get to relax and ease off, whilst 3 and 4 are casting your vision out here in the distance. And then we can go back in and stare at our screen again, or whatever it is that we have to do now with our eyes able to properly focus on the task at hand. That's super common, okay? Now, if you don't want to do that, you could very simply get something in your office that like is reasonably far away that you have to kind of squint and focus. Like, as dumb as it sounds, like the eye chart that you have to read at the optometrist, or whatever it's called, right? Like if you had that on the opposite side of your office, you could literally just turn around and read that a couple of times, and that would do a very similar thing to this, right? It could then also just be lack of movement. There's no blood flow going through the system, which basically, for want of a better word, is going to make the system go stale because blood isn't flowing, nutrients aren't getting delivered, that type of thing. This is why getting up from your desk regularly will improve your cognition. In fact, when they've done studies on people that have like walking desks, they found pretty good improvements in cognition and focus and processing and so on. And it's actually really surprising how fast that walking pace can be before you actually start to see a detriment to their cognition. I think it was like, I can't remember if it was like 3.5 miles an hour or something weird like that, where up to that point, their processing, their retention, all that type of thing actually got better. Okay, so let's look at supplementation. Just because we all want to know this bit, right? So let's look at the good things that we can do to enhance sleep first. So we've already mentioned melatonin and how important that melatonin spike in the latter half of the day is to set up the circadian rhythm for all those sleep patterns that we want, right? So again, we can supplement with that. Now, dosage here varies massively. Like some people will take like 2 milligrams and be perfect. And if they take 3, they feel half asleep the next day. They're super sensitive to it, right? Maybe it's because their own endogenous melatonin spike is already super high. Whereas other people can go 20, 30, 40, that's 40 is pretty high dose, but people do it, right? And that's where actually their sweet spot is, like genuine. Like for me, for example, my best dose is like 20 milligrams. And anything, any way up or down from that is worse, okay? Now again, you will differ in how well you metabolize it. Like for me, super fast. I literally take it like 10 minutes before I go to bed and boom, like that. The average person is probably going to want to take it somewhere between like 60 and 90 minutes before their desired sleep time because they'll metabolize it slower and they need time for all those things to kick in. Again, the whole idea that exogenous melatonin intake will disrupt your endogenous melatonin intake has been pretty conclusively disproven at this point. So you don't need to worry about addiction or anything like that, or like messing up your own system. Then we have glycine. So glycine's really cool. First, we thought glycine really acted on adrenaline and things like that because of the effects that it has. But what glycine actually does, and this is really cool, you have a center in your brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which we're going to shorten to SCN, which is, it does a lot of things related to circadian rhythm, but it's basically like your body's thermostat. So we already mentioned about how core temperature coming down is conducive to you sleeping, right? Glycine will bind to SCN and help your core temperature come down. So this is really, if you're like a hot sleeper like I am, this is a great option, right? It's also super cheap, which is great. Now, let's say, for example, you're also someone who, maybe not even out of choice, but has to train in the evening. Obviously, training is going to spike cortisol and adrenaline. It's also going to raise your your body temperature pretty high. So like glycine post-workout, and then maybe again before you go to bed, is going to be a great way of forcing your core body temperature to come down quicker so that you can fall asleep despite training late in the day. So again, super cheap, super affordable, doesn't really have any negative effects. Good one to try. Magnesium, obviously very commonly associated with sleep supplementation. The reason for that is because it will bind in the brain to G protein coupled receptors, which basically help kick adrenaline off the receptor. So adrenaline is bound, magnesium comes in and through some clever trickery kicks the adrenaline off, which basically helps sympathetic activation come down, which obviously means parasympathetic state can come up. Generally, they all work pretty well. Like magnesium glycinate tends to work well because it has glycine with it, so that's kind of cool. But if we want like purely neurological or like cognitive benefits, generally threonate, is it threonate? Can't remember how it's pronounced, has been the one that's been shown to have the most positive effect on sleep and cognition. So that might be the one you want to favor there, but all magnesium is pretty good. Okay, now let's look at these. I put these on there because they're cool, but they also act on a different mechanism, right? So like we have dragon's blood and pearl's powder. Like who doesn't want to take those two supplements, okay? Dragon's blood is the sap of an okra tree, which has an ORAC score of, I think it's like 2 million or something like that. So ORAC, I think it's like 2 million or higher. An ORAC score is measuring its antioxidative effect. Now that is huge. I think curcumin might be like 100,000. So it's like 20 times more of an antioxidant than curcumin is. And like curcumin obviously is always like hailed as like amazing for that, right? So incredibly powerful antioxidant. Then we have pearl powder, which is literally crushed up pearls, freshwater pearls, not marine pearls, whatever they would be called because of the mercury content. Freshwater pearl powder will do a very similar thing. It will bring down inflammation through a different pathway. It also increases your endogenous glutathione production, which is great. It's another thing that gets released at night, which is a very strong anti-inflammatory and antioxidant alongside melatonin. So these two together are very good for bringing down inflammation. Now, the reason that's important is because we mentioned you've got the glymphatic system up here and kind of the lymphatic system that does the rest of the body. If inflammation is super high in the body and the lymphatic system is taking up all the resources, the glymphatic system won't work particularly well. So it will get suppressed because like resources are needed elsewhere. If your cerebral inflammation is super high, well then your glymphatic system isn't going to have time to do the things it needs to do in the time that you're asleep. So regardless of what the root cause or where the location of the excessive inflammation is, these can be super helpful for that. I know when I first started helping Dave, like I think the lowest score I saw was like he had 3 minutes of REM sleep on his night to sleep. Bear in mind, he was asleep for like 7 hours, right? So it's not like he slept for an hour, right? And that was because his inflammation was incredibly high. So dragon's blood and pearl powder come in to his nighttime routine, and within like 3 or 4 weeks, his REM and deep sleep are both climbing up just from that addition. So if you're someone who has like autoimmune problems, arthritis, all this type of thing, or is just very inflamed, those can be super helpful there, okay? Let's look at peptides because like they're like in vogue right now. Everyone wants to know about peptides. So a common one that gets put out there is DSIP, delta sleep inducing peptide, right? It's a weird one because like for 50% of people, it is an absolute godsend and it just changes the game entirely, right? And then for the other 50%, it does absolutely nothing. It's interesting. Now, the people this tends to work best in are the people who have what's called HPT. We're not going to go there, right? Basically, who are overly anxious and very stressed. So if we go way back here, we got this, right? DSIP works well for someone who's like up here all the time. So we got the hypothalamic pituitary axis. Told you it wasn't worth remembering, right? They're up here all the time. And what DSIP comes in is it comes in and it dampens that activity. So it like brings it down. Okay? So that means then the melatonin can rise afterwards. So if you're someone who is naturally pretty anxious and gets woken up very easily, which is a sign that your cortisol is too high, this can work really well. Now, for most, it's going to work better when taken in the evening for kind of obvious reasons, right? Because like you need cortisol to come down. But there are some people who actually benefit most from it in the morning. Those tend to be the people that are super anxious or just have huge amounts of stress. So cortisol is even higher again, and it can help keep them on a more even keel throughout the day as well. Some people even benefit from taking it AM and PM. PM tends to be the most common. Best time to take it though. Okay, then we also have epitalin. Now this is really cool because we mentioned earlier that as you age, your sleep architecture tends to kind of degrade. So like those sleep cycles that we looked at earlier, we can go back. This whole structure tends to deteriorate and kind of doesn't get as nice to look at, should we say, right? This happens as you get older. Now this is largely driven by the pineal gland, which is a tiny little gland in your brain, which really does control your circadian rhythm to a large degree. Now, when we take epitalin, that actually improves the function of your pineal gland, can even help rehypertrophy your pineal gland because it does atrophy over time, kind of withers away and dies like most things as we get older, right? So your pineal gland now functions better and it reestablishes this sleep architecture. So now you sleep better, you get more deep and REM sleep because your body basically does the right things at the right time. So if you are someone who's maybe on the older side and their sleep has gotten worse over time, then that's probably going to be a really good option for you. This also has really good effects on reducing neurological inflammation. So again, if you're someone who's naturally very inflamed, poor recovery, whatever else, it's a good option for you. The other benefit for taking, let's say this is in more of an aging population, but epitalin has another really cool effect where it activates and increases telomerase activity. So we take, you've got your little strands of DNA, right? They've got telomeres on the end. Now the telomeres here, they are what basically protects the DNA from being unraveled and broken down, right? Now, when telomerase's job is to maintain these telomeres and keep them sturdy and strong because they do break down over time, right? Again, as we get older, these telomeres get broken down and damaged, and then the DNA itself can get damaged. Epitalin comes in and increases telomerase activity so that these telomeres actually get lengthened more appropriate, or better, should we say. So you're more resistant to that genetic breakdown. So that's kind of cool if you want to look at it from a longevity standpoint, right? Then we can also look at Solank. So there are hundreds of things you could take here. I'm just trying to pick up like the obvious ones or maybe ones that people aren't that familiar with. So Solank works by improving your GABA activation. So your main inhibitory neurotransmitters are serotonin and GABA. Serotonin is kind of like your brake on your car, kind of like dials you up and down. So like, it's not like your handbrake, because that's what GABA would be. GABA is like on or off. It will just like put you bang straight into parasympathetic mode, or it's off and it's not really doing anything. It's the way to think about it, okay? So like serotonin will dial you up and down appropriately during the day based on whatever's happening, whereas GABA is like, boom, it's time to like be chilled out now, okay? So we can improve our GABA activity, which obviously is very appropriate when we're trying to go to sleep. So if you're someone who's naturally very anxious, has racing thoughts when they go to sleep, all that type of thing, Solank can be a really, really good option for you here. Now, let's say you just have crappy sleep due to whatever unavoidable circumstance. Maybe you got a newborn or crazy work period, whatever, right? When we don't sleep well, we don't get enough of that glymphatic clearance. We end up accumulating neurological inflammation, which is why we get brain fog and all our cognition gets worse, right? Because of that inflammation, we don't clear out all those proteins that we want to. And as a result of that, glutamate spikes up. Glutamate is neurotoxic when it's too high. Now, if you're in this scenario, what you can do to help alleviate some of these sleep deprivation symptoms is to take high-dose creatine. Now, what's high dose will depend on the individual, but it's going to be a minimum of 10 grams. Some people will benefit more from like 20 to 30, maybe even higher, depending on how big you are. And also Nupept. So Nupept is another cool peptide that increases your processing speed, your memory recall, and all that type of thing, but it also has a really cool effect of really bringing down glutamate, which will get high when you're sleep deprived. So creatine will come in and be very anti-inflammatory, basically makes up for what your glymphatic system didn't do. Nupept will also be slightly anti-inflammatory, but primarily is going to increase your processing speed and stop that glutamate level from being too high, which again ends up giving you mood swings and all this type of thing, right? So those can be used during periods of lesser sleep for whatever reason to help alleviate some of those sleep deprivation issues. In a perfect world, you'd actually do your creatine intranasally so it can go straight to where we want it to go. Obviously, in that scenario, you're not taking 20 grams or whatever it might be. Then we're literally going to be looking at like milligrams of creatine in that scenario, but you can combine these in a nasal spray, and that does the job pretty damn well, pretty damn fast. Let's look at the not so good ways of improving your sleep, right? So we have NyQuil, which is basically a painkiller with antihistamine, with Tylenol, which is, again, acetaminophen with diphenhydramine added to it, which again is an antihistamine. Let's look at those two first. Now, these are commonly used for people as a sleep aid. The problem with these is that when we're dealing with an antihistamine, a histamine is a neurotransmitter released by your brain to increase wakefulness and alertness, right? And obviously an antihistamine is going to bring the levels of those down significantly, which sounds great. But the problem is when we bring histamines way down, what we do is basically induce, what's the way to put this? We sedate a person when we bring histamines really low. But there's a massive difference between sedation and sleep. Like, you don't wake up from like medical sedation feeling wonderfully refreshed, right? There's a reason for that, because like what happens is when you're sedated, you don't go through these sleep patterns that we've been talking about. You don't get the deep and the REM sleep that we've been talking, at least not to the same degree. So yes, you fall asleep, but the downside is that the quality of your sleep is now considerably worse. So quite often you end up worse off, especially because diphenhydramine especially has a really long half-life. So like it's still in your system when you wake up. So those histamines can't spike in the morning like we want them to. So now not only did the quality of your sleep go down, you also have this thing still in your system making you feel drowsy. Now the problem with diphenhydramine specifically is that it will affect acetylcholine production. Okay, so we discussed how that's one of your neurological fuel sources, right? When you take diphenhydramine, your levels of acetylcholine will now be lower. So not only do you feel groggy and have worse sleep, you now have less fuel for your brain, okay? Let's look at these two now. So we have CBD, basically weed and all the gummies and that type of thing, and benzodiazepines, which actually is more common than you think, right? Now, we see the same thing with these. What we get is sedation and not sleep. And the problem with CBD especially is that its effects are very dose dependent. What I mean by that is, for the vast majority of people, CBD in small doses is actually stimulatory. And there's like this weird inverse relationship with dosing where as the dose goes up, it then gets more sedative. So for most to get a meaningful sedative effect from CBD, the dose also has to be pretty high. Now, when we do that, it obviously has interactions with the endocannabinoid system, which then disrupts serotonin. So the problem is then, once again, we maybe fall asleep because we're anxious or whatever it might be, but now our serotonin signaling is considerably worse and our sleep architecture gets worse as a result of that. So once again, deep and REM sleep ends up coming way down. Same with alcohol. Alcohol does the exact same thing. And we see the exact same thing with benzos, but to an even greater degree. So both of these will cause your sleep architecture to deteriorate, kind of like we discussed about with elderly people or as you get older, right? So then the problem is you get what's called rebound insomnia. So as you take these, your sleep architecture gradually degrades, but you're still sleeping because they sedate you. Remember, it's different to sleep. But then when you stop taking them, and now you need to depend on your circadian rhythm, your normal sleep architecture to sleep, you have ruined it. So now you have insomnia. So you think, well, I'm going to go back to taking CBD, and down the rabbit hole you go, right? It gets pretty bad pretty fast in some cases. So I'm not saying never use them. I'm not saying they're bad, right? There's not really such thing as bad or good here. There's use cases, but just be aware that just because you go unconscious and then wake up in the morning does not mean you're sleeping, or at least does not mean you're sleeping well. So that needs to be kind of thought about. Now, before we end, I think it would be remiss of me to not talk about caffeine, because vitamin C is incredibly important, and we know this, right? So let's just briefly touch on caffeine and kind of what it does so that you can understand why it may be good and why it may be bad. Right, so caffeine works on the adenosine system, okay? So as you're awake and burning through neurological resources, you accumulate adenosine, okay? So we've got I have these little A molecules here, okay? Like this is, I know this is a terrible drawing, you don't need to tell me. Okay? So as we go throughout our day, we accumulate adenosine. So now we have little receptors over here, which I'm going to draw in the most simple way humanly possible, right? That's adenosine binds to. Now, the main ones we're concerned about here are the A1 receptors. There's A1 through 4, but for what we're talking about, really A1 is really the only relevant one. Now, what happens throughout our day is we accumulate adenosine and it comes in and it binds to these A1 receptors. And the effect of that is that it makes you feel drowsy. Because basically what it does is it lowers the release of sympathetic neurotransmitters and it increases the release of parasympathetic neurotransmitters. Remember, sympathetic is get up and go, parasympathetic is chill out and do nothing, right? So you start to feel tired, not so motivated, and drowsy through the day as a result of adenosine. Okay, right. So where does caffeine come into this? Why does it make me feel so good? Well, what caffeine does, right, in whatever form you decide to ingest it, it comes in and it occupies these receptors. So you're still accumulating adenosine as your days go on, but they can't bind to the receptor because caffeine has gone in there and blocked it. So this is cool, right? So now I don't get tired. This is okay. What's the problem with this? Obviously, caffeine has a certain half-life. So we want it out of our system in time for us to go to sleep. And, we want those parasympathetic neurotransmitters to come up at some point because we need to sleep, right? So obviously taking it too late has those issues. Now, the problem is when we block these receptors, your body goes, all right, I see your game. And what it does is it just makes more and more receptors, A1 receptors in this case. And it goes, all right, there's plenty of other places for adenosine to bind now. So even if you keep blocking it with your one coffee a day, or whatever it is you're having, well, they can all bind over here instead now with these new receptors, which is why you need to progressively intake more caffeine to have the same effect over time, right? And then obviously the problem would be then, let's say your normal intake is like 300 milligrams, which is not a crazy dose unless you're like 40 kilos in body weight, right? Well, the problem is, let's say you take that for like a year. You build up all these receptors. You've got these way more adenosine receptors than maybe you had in the first place, at least A1. And now you go from 300 to 0 for whatever reason. You don't get a chance to have your coffee that day. All of these receptors are now free, right? So what do you think happens? Well, now all of them get bound. Because normally what would happen is there's a certain amount of adenosine and all of them can't bind anyway because there's not enough receptors at once. Now there's this plethora of receptors available and they can just all come in and get occupied. So now you feel terrible. Now you just want to sleep all day, and that is precisely what happens, right? So that is how caffeine functions. So it's up to you to decide like how you want to use that. But general advice is going to be that like for most people, 2 to 3 milligrams per kilogram tends to be quite a sustainable intake. That doesn't quite scale when you get to the very high levels of body weight. If you're super heavyweight, probably don't advise sticking to that, but for 90% of people that tends to work pretty well. But you also need to be aware of what's going on long term here in terms of these adenosine receptors and the fact that if this is creeping up, well then you're going to need that dosage consistently, which we all intrinsically know, right? But the best way to deal with that is either just be happy to cap your intake at a certain point and ideally cap it or limit it to a certain time in the day. The half-life of caffeine does vary based on person to person, but tends to be 5 or 7 hours, the half-life. So like if you have a coffee at 2 p.m., like some of you will have half of that in your system still at 9 p.m., which means all of this is still going on with the sympathetic system going up and this parasympathetic coming down, right? So just be aware that's the mechanism it works on. And that the cool thing about this is that we can resensitize and lose those extra receptors pretty fast. Like we can, for want of a better word, detox from caffeine intake pretty damn fast, but it's a pretty unpleasant process. So that's how caffeine works on the adenosine system. Try and keep it earlier in the day and just be aware of how it functions. Okay, so I have rambled for a very long time at you. Hopefully you're still here. Hopefully you've not fallen asleep unless it's an appropriate time. So we need to be aware that sleep is a very active process. It does a lot of very cool things for us physically and neurologically. So if you want to perform at a high level, whether it's at work, in the gym, or everywhere else, you probably need your sleep to be pretty damn good, okay? Now, how much sleep you need is going to be dependent on lots of factors like your genetics, your workload, and all this type of thing, right? But the point is that you should be using indicators to track whether you are getting enough. That doesn't necessarily mean wearing a little trackable, but like, how do you feel in the morning? How does your energy vary throughout the day? Is it following the pattern that it should? Are you able to wake up without an alarm? So on and so forth, right? And then we need to remember that getting good sleep is not just a case of like being like, oh crap, I need to go to sleep in an hour and then worrying about that, right? Really, quality sleep comes from setting up the entire day to some degree to be conducive towards it. And you know, that's not going to be realistic for everyone, but honestly, my best advice would be try to at least own the first and last hour of your day. Like, your first hour can be where you go through that checklist that we talked about to help reinforce that cortisol spike. You know, it could be like eating a relatively low carb breakfast, doing something that is cognitively challenging, getting some good form of light exposure. Maybe that's it. You know, maybe there's some cold exposure thrown in there or whatever else, right? And then the last hour of your day is where we focus on doing the right things for our parasympathetic system. Maybe we take a little bit of melatonin an hour before we go to bed. Maybe we go and meditate for 10 minutes or do some journaling. Or maybe we just like swap the lights in our bedroom to red lights so that we're not getting blue light. You know, whatever is reasonable for you to do, try and own that last hour of your day and make that as parasympathetic as possible. And then the first hour of your day as sympathetic as possible, so we can at least try to anchor those two spikes that we want in our day, okay? And, you know, we talked about peptides and supplements there at the end. They can make a huge difference and be super beneficial. But generally speaking, they're only going to be able to enhance a system that's already decent. So like what we do, how we structure our day, and all the other stuff that we've talked about is going to be more important, but also lay the foundation for those things also working better. Like if your melatonin spike in the evening is absolutely flat because you're like doing whatever, right? And keeping cortisol super high, taking some melatonin is probably not going to be enough to get you to where you want to be, okay? So as is the case with most things, things we do has a greater effect than things we take. So that has been Sleep 101. That hopefully was very helpful for you. The goal of this rant was to give you a better understanding of like what sleep is. You know, like how do we determine quality and duration that are needed? How do we go about setting up our lifestyle so that it's conducive to good sleep? And, you know, kind of judging how much you need and what are the extras that you can do to help push it in the right directions in terms of supplementation. So hopefully that's been useful. Thank you as always for supporting Elite FTS and watching our content. We will see you next time.